Imagine this: a wounded grizzly bear, heavy with new life, alone in the snowy silence of Montana's Bitterroot Mountains. Her breath is shallow, her body broken. Birth is near, but shelter is not. And then from the shadows they appear. Not fellow bears, not humans, but three coyotes, famously clever, often feared and always misunderstood. What happened next would challenge everything scientists thought they knew about wild animals, and everything we thought we knew about the boundaries between predator and prey. In a place where survival is brutal and beauty is fleeting, this story unfolded far from human eyes until one retired wildlife photographer caught a glimpse. And what he documented over the coming weeks would leave conservationists, stunned families in tears, and thousands of viewers asking the same question: can animals love beyond instinct? This isn't just a story about a grizzly bear giving birth. It's a story about trust forged in snow, compassion in the wild, and the quiet power of connection between species who were never meant to understand each other. So get comfortable, because once this begins, you won't want to look away. The Bitterroot Mountains in early March are no place for the weak. Snow still lingers in the valleys, clinging to the pines like stubborn memories. The wind isn't cruel exactly, but it doesn't care if you're alive or dying. And somewhere deep in those woods, not far from the Idaho border, a grizzly bear named Elena was doing both. No GPS tag had ever tracked her, no researcher had studied her patterns, but the scars along her flank told stories few animals live long enough to finish. That morning, Elena was dragging herself, limping through a hollow beneath a fallen cedar. Her shoulder had been ripped open in a fight with another female over the carcass of a deer. One meal, one moment of hunger. That's all it took to leave her torn and bleeding, with labor contractions already starting. She should have been in a den by now. Grizzly bears almost always give birth in deep winter. Tucked safely in snow-covered dens, they prepare weeks in advance. It's one of nature's most delicate balancing acts, hibernation while growing life. But Elena hadn't made it to that part. Something had gone wrong. Maybe she'd been chased from her territory. Maybe the fight delayed her. No one would ever know. But this much was certain: she was losing strength fast, and her cubs were coming whether she was ready or not. With every step, blood spattered in the snow behind her. Her breathing came in short, wet bursts. Her back legs shook beneath the weight of her body and the lives inside it. Her paws pushed forward through the soft crust of old snow. Her claws, cracked and dirt-caked, found no traction. Still she moved. There's something sacred in watching a mother fight for her young. You don't need to speak the language of grizzlies to feel it. Across every species, something ancient lives in that instinct, the choice to keep going when giving up would be easier. It's the same force that pushes turtles to cross roads or wounded deer to disappear into thickets, to give birth in silence. Wild animals don't have comfort, they only have purpose. Elena's body knew what was coming. Her contractions began to rise in rhythm. Her back arched, then dropped. She let out a low, guttural exhale, not quite a growl, not quite a cry. Something in between, something private. And then she collapsed beneath the branches of a wind-felled tree, snow drifting against her side. She didn't know she was being watched. A few hundred feet away, nestled quietly behind a thicket of deadwood and fir, a retired wildlife photographer named Marcus Hall was adjusting his trail cam. He'd been monitoring movement near the creek, mostly hoping to spot elk. Instead, he caught a glimpse of her. A bear so large, so powerful, yet moving with such exhaustion, he thought at first she was dying. Through the lens, he saw the blood, the heaving, the eyes that barely opened. Marcus didn't move. He didn't dare. He simply watched and let his camera do the work. At 67, he'd seen his share of wildlife drama, but nothing like this. Not in winter, not with a grizzly this exposed, and not with what came next. Before we get to that, there's something else you need to know about Elena. Like all mothers, she wasn't born knowing how to raise young. She learned. Long ago, when she was just a cub, tucked against her own mother's massive side, Elena had known safety. It came in the form of warmth, her mother's breath fogging the frozen air, the gentle pressure of a paw curling protectively around her. In the way of animals, there had been no language, no bedtime stories. But there was rhythm, heartbeats, stillness, the quiet knowing that even if the world was cold, her mother would not leave. That memory lived inside Elena now, not as a thought, but as a drive. She'd lost her mother to poachers before her second year. And even though she hadn't understood death at the time, she'd understood absence. From that moment, she carried a truth most wild animals learn far too early. The world does not wait for healing, but motherhood had brought something back. Something she didn't expect. The feeling of becoming shelter, instead of needing it. As she lay under that tree, groaning through the next wave of pain, her ears twitched. A sound. Not the wind. Not footsteps heavy enough to be a cougar. This was lighter, faster, purposeful. Coyotes. 3 of them. Marcus tensed, one hand frozen on his camera. Coyotes were common here, smart, clever scavengers. He'd watched them pull down fawns. He'd seen them nip at the heels of injured moose, wait out badgers, and sniff around bear scat like streetwise survivalists. But they'd never approached a grizzly. Not like this. One by one they emerged. First came a silver-coated female with one ear torn and stiff from frostbite raven. She stepped slowly, head lowered, body language neutral. Behind her came Tucker, stocky, wary eyes scanning the ridge. And trailing behind was Scout, the youngest, his tail flicking with curiosity. They stopped a few feet from Elena, watched, waited, listened. Elena didn't move. Her eyes opened just barely. A low growl rumbled in her throat, but she didn't lunge. She couldn't. And for reasons no one would ever understand fully, the coyotes didn't leave. They circled. Not quickly, not like a hunt. It was slower, cautious. As if they were reading the scene and deciding each in their way what this moment would become. What happened next would take days to unfold. But in that moment, something unspoken passed between the animals. Not friendship, not instinct. Something else. A mutual pause. In Yellowstone National Park, researchers once observed coyotes and badgers hunting cooperatively, working in tandem to flush prey. In Africa, lions have been known to spare jackals that linger near their kills. And in rare zoo environments, interspecies bonds form under unnatural conditions of proximity. But this, in the wild, with a laboring grizzly and a trio of scavengers, Marcus didn't know what to call it. He just knew he had to keep watching. He lowered the volume on his camera mic, pressed record, and held his breath. It's easy to look at wild animals and think we understand them, but sometimes what we see challenges everything we thought we knew. This was no longer a story about prey and predator. This was about something else entirely, about empathy, chance, and what happens when nature doesn't follow the script. Elena didn't roar. The coyotes didn't flee. The snow kept falling and the forest for a few brief minutes was still. And that's when the first contraction truly took hold. The journey ahead wouldn't just challenge biology. It would challenge belief. For a moment, time stood still beneath the thick trees of the bitterroot. The grizzly didn't rise. The coyotes didn't pounce. The snow fell unbothered by the strange gathering below. Elena's breaths came in hard, shallow waves. Her body trembled beneath its weight, muscle pain, instinct, unborn life. Yet even in her haze, her eyes locked on the 3 forms before her. Coyotes. She knew their scent. She had driven their kind from her kills before. She had chased them through meadows, snapped at them near berry patches. They were thieves, opportunists. But this time they didn't move like scavengers. They didn't act like intruders. The silver one with the torn ear, Raven, stepped forward first. Slow head, low tail, neither tucked nor raised. Behind her, the younger one, Scout, sat on his haunches, head tilted, ears twitching. Tucker, broader and older, held back. He paced a short half-moon arc, not out of fear but strategy, watching the forest line as though something worse might emerge. And still they didn't leave. No one teaches coyotes what to do in moments like this. There are no rules, no rituals for encountering a laboring bear. But there are instincts, and sometimes instinct whispers something unexpected. Raven took another step forward. She paused, sniffed the air. Blood, birthing fluid, snow, and the slow fading scent of death. Elena growled low in her chest. Not aggressive, just warning. She curled her lips slightly. Her back paw twitched, but she didn't attack, and Raven didn't retreat. Somewhere buried deep beneath muscle and fur, another contraction built like a slow wave. Elena's eyes closed tightly, her whole body clenched. When it passed, she exhaled with a sound so soft, so full of surrender, it no longer sounded like a bear at all. It sounded like a mother trying not to fail. That was when Scout stood. He didn't come forward like Raven. Instead, he did something unusual. He let out a short, sharp yip, not loud, not threatening, just a signal. Then he ran. Marcus, still hidden from view with his lens trained on the scene, followed his path with growing disbelief. Scout darted through the snow, vanishing into a thicket on the slope above. He was gone for minutes. 10, then 15. When he returned, something dangled from his jaws. A frozen squirrel stiff with death. Not a gift, not an offering, but perhaps a message. We're not here for her. We're not here for that. Scout dropped the squirrel several feet from Elena, then backed away. Raven sat beside him, breathing slowly, steadily. Tucker stayed near the tree line, never closer than 20 paces. And still none of them left. It's tempting to label this moment, to call it kindness, altruism, empathy, but science doesn't always deal in such words. In fact, for decades, wildlife researchers dismissed the idea that animals could show compassion beyond their species. Survival, after all, demands efficiency, and mercy isn't efficient. But over the past few decades, cracks have begun to appear in that thinking. In 2016, a biologist in Alberta documented a pack of wild wolves feeding an orphaned coyote pup. It wasn't theirs. It brought them no benefit, but they fed it anyway. In Kenya's Tsavo National Park, rangers observed a lioness caring for a baby oryx, feeding it, guarding it, even sleeping beside it. She let it live despite every evolutionary reason not to. And then there are the domestics. Countless dogs around the world have adopted kittens, chicks, and even ducklings. Some cats have been seen nursing puppies. Even in zoos where barriers divide natural enemies, odd friendships arise: tigers and house cats, elephants and sheep, ravens and wolves. Most researchers label these anomalies, exceptions to the rule. But exceptions, when they grow numerous enough, become something more evidence, and perhaps that's what was unfolding in Montana. Marcus, who had spent his life photographing wild animals from behind the safety of a lens, felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just a lucky bear being ignored by hungry coyotes. This was a scene he couldn't explain, only document. He watched as Raven curled up near the base of a tree. Not near Elena, but near enough. She rested her head on her paws, facing the bear. Scout mimicked her posture. Tucker stood his post a little longer, then finally sat. Not relaxed, but not alarmed either. The forest accepted the silence. Here's the thing about wild animals, especially predators like coyotes. They're often misunderstood, labeled as pests, portrayed as villains in rancher stories and suburban headlines. But coyotes are survivors. They adapt. They shift behavior in ways most species can't. And perhaps, just perhaps, part of that adaptation includes recognizing when an old enemy is no longer a threat, but a mother in need. As Elena struggled through another contraction, a soft moan escaped her. Her body arched her claws, digging shallow furrows in the snow. Still, she didn't lash out. The presence of the coyotes didn't seem to agitate her. It seemed to steady her, and in a way, she steadied them too. It was never about friendship. Nature isn't always tender. But what happened in those few hours was something beyond instinct, a kind of momentary truce, a silent recognition. We are not the same, but we are not strangers either. Not now. And maybe that's where the real lesson lives, not in imagining animals as human, but in realizing that survival can look like mercy. That the need to protect, to nurture, to coexist isn't only ours. It belongs to the wild too. By dusk, Marcus adjusted his camera battery and leaned back against his pack. His breath fogged the air. He hadn't moved in hours, neither had they. Raven lifted her head once to sniff the wind. Tucker flicked his ear at the sound of a distant branch cracking. Scout rested his chin on his forepaws, eyes half closed. And Elena, her body slowly stilling, let out a final exhale for the night. It would be days before the cubs arrived, but the story had already begun, and the rules, it seemed, were already being rewritten. By the third day, the forest began to shift. The storm clouds that had rolled over the Bitterroot Mountains finally thinned. Icicles fell from tree branches like glass threads snapping loose. In the distance, a raven called sharp and cold, and for a moment the world felt like it was waking up. But beneath a crooked pine near the valley floor, Elena, the grizzly bear, wasn't waking. She was bracing. The contractions had become stronger, closer together. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Her body, so powerful and feared in any other context, now trembled between waves of pain. She had stopped growling, stopped flinching. She had given up defending her space, and still the coyotes remained. Raven, the old female, sat nearby. Scout had taken to pacing back and forth long loops through the underbrush. Something about him had changed. He was restless, alert, not toward Elena, but away from her, as if he was searching for something she hadn't yet found. And Tucker, ever the observer, now stayed behind Elena, not watching her, but listening. Every rustle, every shift in the forest air. It was as if the three of them had become her senses, while she labored an unspoken perimeter around a predator who could kill them in seconds, but didn't. Then it happened. Without warning, Scout darted off into the woods, not for prey, not to call the others, but with a strange certainty, like something he'd been thinking about for hours had finally resolved. Marcus, watching from his hidden perch behind the ridge, lost sight of him completely. He adjusted his camera angle. Nothing. Gone. Elena didn't move. She was too deep into her labor to notice. Her massive body shifted with another contraction. Her claws scratched the snow. A soft, almost imperceptible whimper came from her throat, a sound no one would expect from a creature so strong. And yet, she was still alive, still fighting. For them. An hour passed, then two. Then Scout returned. He wasn't alone. What trailed behind him was no animal, but something man-made yet wild all the same. A place. A structure buried deep in the woods that only an animal with a low profile and a sharp nose would find. A badger den, long abandoned, tucked under a root system of a pine, so gnarled it looked like it had grown upside down. Scout led the way toward it, glancing back more than once. Raven stood. Tucker rose. Marcus leaned forward. He didn't dare breathe too loudly. The coyotes approached Elena, not together, but in order. First Raven, then Tucker, Scout last. They didn't push. They didn't hurt. But they moved as one, each taking a position around her, and then Scout barked once. Short. Crisp. Elena's eyes fluttered open. She sniffed, not in defense, but in recognition. The air was shifting. Scout barked again, softer this time. Then he turned tail high and began to walk toward the den. Raven followed. Tucker stayed close to Elena, not touching her, but just behind, and with what looked like enormous effort, Elena stood. She groaned low, then lifted one paw, then another, and began to follow. The journey was slow, painful. She collapsed twice. Once she stopped completely. Marcus thought she might not get up again, but then Raven doubled back. She sat facing Elena as if waiting. And somehow the bear rose once more. Together they reached the den. It wasn't large, it wasn't warm. It wasn't what she needed, but it was what she had. Elena crawled inside her body, barely fitting. Her sides pressed against the walls. She curled as best she could, resting her head on a patch of pine needles someone, possibly Raven, had pushed inside earlier that morning. Scout stood guard outside the entrance. His eyes are sharp, ears pivoting. Tucker began to pace. And Raven. She lay down, just a few feet from the opening, not facing it, just near. In that moment, something unspoken crystallized. A line had been crossed but not violated. A pact had been made but never declared. This wasn't about kindness. It wasn't about dominance or submission. It wasn't even about survival. It was about staying. About not leaving when it would have been easier to disappear into the trees. And that in the wild is a kind of miracle. Grizzlies don't cohabitate. Coyotes don't protect other predators. But nature, when pushed to its limits, writes new rules. And sometimes those rules are born not out of instinct, but out of observation. Animals see more than we think. Real-life parallels aren't common, but they exist. In Yellowstone, biologists once documented a lone wolf who trailed a grizzly for days, not for food, but seemingly for protection. In the Mojave, coyotes and badgers have been seen hunting side by side, taking turns chasing prey into one another's waiting jaws. These are not fairy tales. These are recorded facts. But they defy traditional explanation. Some experts call it crisis-induced cooperation. Others call it temporary coexistence. But maybe, just maybe, it's something else. Maybe when death feels near, life holds more value than fear. That night, Elena gave birth to 2 cubs. Marcus didn't witness it. He knew better than to approach the den. But his trail cam, positioned at a respectful distance, captured the muffled sounds of her breathing changing. The groans became deeper, more rhythmic, then suddenly the sharp cry of something small, then another. It worked. Despite the odds, despite the torn shoulder, despite the blood loss, despite the cold. She did it. The next morning, Raven sat at the den entrance, ears up, tail still. Tucker brought a squirrel carcass and dropped it at the edge of the tree roots. Scout didn't leave his post for over 6 hours. Elena didn't come out. She didn't need to. She was inside, alive, feeding her young, recovering. And around her, without ceremony or explanation, stood a family not born by blood, but built by choice. There's a lesson here, not just for wildlife biologists, but for all of us. That sometimes the right place isn't where you plan to be. The right protection doesn't come from those who look like you. And the right kind of love, the kind that stays when staying is hard, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it has fur and torn ears and yellow eyes that never blink. Sometimes it looks like a pact in the pines. For 3 days the den remained still. No one entered, no one left. Snow drifted against the pine roots like it was trying to seal the moment in time. And inside, Elena nursed her 2 cubs with a quiet resolve that surprised even her. They were fragile things, barely the size of squirrels, blind, trembling against her belly. She knew their sounds already, the soft squeaks of hunger, the rhythmic smacks of feeding, the occasional chirp when one kicked the other. She didn't name them. She didn't need to. In the wild, names are given by survival, not sentiment. Outside, the coyotes took turns standing guard. Scout barely moved from the trail's edge. Raven slept only in short intervals. Tucker ranged furthest, sniffing along the perimeter, circling for threats. Each returned with something: scraps of meat, dried moss feathers from a downed bird. Not once did they try to enter the den. And Elena, she stayed silent. Until the 4th morning. It began with a sound no one wanted to hear. A sharp snap, too loud to be wind. Scout rose immediately, ears perked, tail stiff. Raven lifted her head and gave a low, short warning, yip. Tucker, who had just returned with a half-frozen vole, dropped it and took off uphill. Something was moving fast, heavy, purposeful. Through the bare birches came a blur, brown, thick-necked and fast. A wolverine, not large but aggressive. Mean, known to take down prey 3 times its size, and known for one thing more than any other: not backing down. Scout barked furiously. Raven lunged forward, placing herself between the den and the path. But she was small no match in a fight. Tucker emerged from the right flanking, The wolverine paused, snarled eyes locked on the scent he'd followed blood-birth and the wet musk of vulnerable cubs. Then from the den came something that stopped everything. A sound so low and primal it seemed to come from the ground itself. A roar not loud but deep, like thunder beneath your feet. The kind of sound that silences birds, that sends deer leaping from the brush, that makes every other predator think twice. Elena. In one smooth movement, she emerged slowly, but with certainty. Not fast, not flailing, just present, commanding. Her body, still recovering, trembled slightly. Her eyes, those soft, half-closed eyes from just days ago, now flashed cold amber, focused, alert. The wolverine froze. Scout backed off, giving her space. Raven took a step to the side. Tucker held his ground, but watched carefully. Elena stepped forward. No longer curled, no longer hiding. She wasn't there to scare. She was there to warn. Another step, and another. She lowered her head ears, back lips curled just enough. Not baring her teeth, just showing what was there. The wolverine hissed once. Then, like a fire without oxygen, it faded, turned, disappeared into the trees. No contact, no chase, just presence. And just like that, the bear was no longer being protected. She was the protector. Elena stood at the den's entrance for a long time after, breathing heavily, eyes scanning. When she finally turned to go back inside, she paused, looked toward the 3 coyotes, each sitting quietly now. Not cowering, not bowing, just watching. Something between them had changed, not earned in words, but in blood. If you've never seen a wild animal protect another species, it's easy to think it doesn't happen. But examples are out there, hidden between the folds of what science can measure and what nature simply does. In India, a tigress once took in a litter of orphaned jackals. In a wildlife rehab center in Alaska, an injured grizzly was seen gently licking the wound of a rescued fox that had been placed nearby for observation. These moments don't last forever, but they happen. Not out of logic, not out of instinct, but something in between, something most biologists can't yet explain. In that moment under the pines, Elena did something else, something small but unforgettable. She approached Raven, not fast, not tense, just calm. She stopped, a foot away, lowered her head and groomed her. Just once, a slow lick to the side of her torn ear. Raven didn't flinch. Tucker looked away, and Scout, for the first time, lay down fully, his side exposed to the bear. The rules had changed, not just for that day, but for whatever would come next, because in the wild, trust isn't built by sharing food. It's built in silence, in moments where fear could take over but doesn't. Elena returned to the den. Raven followed to the entrance and curled up against the roots. Tucker resumed his patrol. Scout moved to a higher rock to scan the ridge, and from the trees Marcus lowered his camera. He wasn't sure what he was filming anymore. It wasn't just a bear giving birth. It wasn't just coyotes guarding something they could have stolen. It was something rarer, a relationship that none of them should have been part of, but all had chosen. And maybe that's what trust is. Not safety, not peace, but choosing to stay when you don't have to. It happened during the storm. Not the loud kind, the silent one. The kind of storm that creeps in overnight, settling between the trees without thunder or wind. A quiet snow that falls straight down so thick it muffles every sound in the forest. Even the coyotes didn't bark that morning. Even the birds went still. Inside the den, Elena had sensed it before the first flake touched the pine. Her breath had grown short. Her muscles stiff from the cold that crept in even through the thick bed of moss and feathers Raven had gathered. She curled tighter around her cubs, trying to block the draft. But one of them was already too quiet. The smaller cub, the one who nursed slower, who whimpered instead of cried, had barely moved since midnight. His breath, once shallow but present, now flickered between silence and stillness. Elena nosed him gently. Nothing. She nuzzled him again. He twitched, then nothing. A soft sound escaped her throat, part whimper, part growl. She nudged him again, this time harder. He didn't respond. She didn't call for help. Bears don't cry out when they lose something. They don't wail or mourn in ways we recognize. But they pause. They linger. And in that pause, there's a knowing. Marcus, watching from his camera through the snow-covered branches, couldn't see inside the den, but he heard it a long, low exhale, unlike anything she'd made before. Not pain, not fatigue, just a release like something in her had broken gently. Hours passed. She didn't leave. The living cub clung to her side, still blind, unaware of what had changed. Elena kept them close, but her paw rested on the unmoving body. She didn't push it away. She didn't bury it. She just stayed beside it. Outside, Raven kept her post at the den's mouth. Tucker paced restlessly in widening circles. Scout, usually the most curious, sat perfectly still, his head low, ears pulled back. Something in the air had shifted, and they all felt it. Because grief, even among wild animals, has a shape. It doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like stillness, like waiting beside something that will never move again, like guarding something that no longer needs protecting. In 2018, wildlife researchers in Washington documented a group of orcas carrying a dead calf for 17 days, refusing to let go. In India, a langur was seen carrying her lifeless infant for nearly 2 weeks, grooming its fur curling around it at night. And in Alaska, a mother polar bear once lay for 3 full days beside her frozen cub before wandering off alone. These aren't myths. They're data, observed, recorded, real. But in the wild, moments like these don't make headlines. They don't go viral. They just vanish like the snow melting into the earth. That morning, something else arrived at the den. Not dangerous, not another predator. A gesture. Raven stood and walked a slow circle around the entrance. She paused near the opening, then disappeared into the trees. When she returned, she carried something in her mouth, a small tangle of feathers, pine needles, and moss. She didn't enter the den. She placed it just at the edge, then backed away. A nest, not a gift, not a replacement, just something soft. Elena didn't move, but she saw it, and she left it there. Tucker curled beside Raven later that afternoon. Scout crept closer to the den than he'd ever dared. He didn't go in. He just lay at the base of a stump nearby, his eyes on the tree line, as if daring the forest to send another test. By nightfall, the snow had eased. The wind shifted east, and the cold relented just enough for the surviving cub to shift nurse and let out a soft squeak of life. Elena responded with a low grumble and pulled the living room closer. But she didn't move, the one that was gone, not until the next morning. Marcus watched as she carried it not far, not fast, just to the edge of the clearing. She placed it under a log and covered it with her paw, not buried exactly, but hidden, protected in some small way. Then she returned to the den. The forest didn't mark the moment, no sound, no ritual, but something had been honored. Here's the thing about loss. Humans often believe it makes us alone in the animal kingdom. That's because we speak of our dead. We're the only ones who feel their absence. But if you spend enough time watching the wild, really watching, you'll see the same patterns. The hesitation before walking away. The soft nudge that doesn't wake anything. The refusal to leave until the last possible second. These are not human traits. They're life traits. And perhaps the lesson here isn't about death, but about the ones who remain. Because while Elena grieved, her cub still needed her. And she didn't stop caring. She didn't retreat. She didn't give up. She carried on with one less heartbeat in the den, and one more reason to fight. Later that week, Marcus reviewed the footage for his archive. He didn't post it. He didn't share it. He labeled it quietly. Elena, March 17. Loss. Just 2 minutes long. Just one moment. He watched it twice, then shut the file and went outside. The snow had stopped. The sky was gray-blue, soft and endless. And in the trees, something small moved. Scout trotting between shadows, his head low, tail swaying. Still here, still watching, still part of whatever this strange, impossible family had become. As humans, we often imagine nature as brutal, savage, indifferent, and yes, it can be. But it's also capable of something else, something quieter, a form of respect, a way of acknowledging life and loss without spectacle. Maybe in some ways that's more sacred than anything we could ever script. Marcus Hall had learned long ago that the best wildlife photographers are ghosts. You show up before the light, does you leave after the last track is covered, and you never interrupt what you came to witness. His job wasn't to save. It was to see. And for more than 30 years that rule had served him well. Until Scout didn't return. At first, Marcus didn't worry. Coyotes are wanderers. Scout had always been the curious one, young, nimble, eager to vanish into the trees and reappear hours later with a strip of hide or a broken bone in his teeth. But that morning something felt wrong. The den was quiet. Raven stood alert. Tucker paced in tight circles, and Elena, who rarely peeked from the den unless she had to, now sat at its mouth, watching. They were waiting. By mid-morning, Marcus packed up his gear and took a different trail than usual south along the base of the ridge where the trees thinned into rocky, human-used paths. It was a risk. He'd promised himself not to interfere, not even to track the coyotes' routes. But something tugged at him, a kind of gravity he couldn't name. A mile out he saw it. The wire was rusted looped through a low branch and staked into the dirt. A snare. Illegal even in this part of Montana, and in it, silent and still, was Scout. His back paw was caught high, suspended just off the ground. Blood soaked the snow below him. His ribs heaved slow and shallow. One eye opened when Marcus stepped closer. He didn't growl. He didn't flinch. He just waited. Marcus froze. This was the line. The one every wildlife observer knows but never wants to face. Step in and you change the story. Stay out and you might lose it. Either way, something shifts. He moved fast. With gloved hands, he knelt and cut the snare wire loose from the branch. Scout didn't resist, but his breathing sharpened. Marcus worked quickly, murmuring without realizing. "You're okay. Just hold still." The wire unwound like a cruel vine. Scout's paw was mangled, but intact. When the last loop fell away, Scout stumbled. He tried to stand, failed, then limped forward just once, then collapsed beside a tree. Marcus backed off. He didn't touch him again. He just waited. For 10 minutes, then 20. Then Scout stood, shaky, lopsided, but upright. They looked at each other just for a second. Then, Scout vanished into the trees, dragging his leg like a thread unraveling from a coat. Marcus sat in the snow for a long time. In wildlife circles, this kind of interference is considered a sin. Nature doesn't need heroes, the old wisdom says. It needs silence, patience, restraint. But that morning, Marcus didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who hadn't been able to look away. He reported the trap anonymously, then hiked back to his ridge. By dusk, the den had changed. Elena was resting. Raven, for the first time in days, was curled against her side, not outside the den, but beside her. Tucker sat watch near the tree line, and just before the sun dipped behind the trees, Scout returned. Limping, bloodied, but alive. He didn't make a sound. He just lay down outside the den entrance, dropped a thin stick near Raven's paw, and rested his head in the snow. Later that night, Marcus reviewed the footage he had taken over the past week. He opened a new file, titled it Intervention, March 24th. He watched himself walk into frame, tools in hand, head bowed. Then he closed the file. He would never post it. This part wasn't for the audience. It was for him, but the story didn't stay quiet for long. The next morning, a letter arrived at the Wildlife Center's inbox, the one that quietly hosted Marcus's camera stream for local classrooms and researchers. It came from Wisconsin, written by a woman named Edna, age 74. She'd been following the stream since early February. Her husband had passed the year before, and she found comfort in watching the rhythms of wild animals survive through winter. Her email was short. I saw the little one with the limp come back. I don't know what happened, but I'm glad someone was there. Sometimes it's not about saving the world. Just saving something small, that's enough. Marcus didn't reply. But he saved the email, printed it, folded it into his field notebook. Because sometimes the connection between wildlife and people doesn't require explanation. It just needs to be felt. There's an idea popular in science that interfering with nature ruins it. That helps break the ecosystem's rhythm, and in many cases that's true. But not always. Sometimes stepping in doesn't change the outcome, it simply gives it a chance. Real-world conservation has always walked that line. In 2010, a team of biologists in California broke protocol to rescue a trapped mountain lion cub. In Yellowstone, a pack of wolves was allowed to raise pups near a controlled human fire line, protected, yes, but left to finish the work themselves. In those cases, the intervention didn't destroy the wild bond. It strengthened it. Because help, when done quietly, can be part of the story, not the end of it. And maybe that's what Marcus had done. Not changed the story, just kept it going. Scout's injury never fully healed. He walked with a limp from then on, slower than the others, but he kept his place. Tucker never challenged him. Raven groomed him more often than before. Elena never seemed to treat him differently. That too is part of nature's wisdom, to accept scars without shame. A week later, the snow began to thin. Small green shoots appeared at the base of fallen logs. Spring was coming, not in full, but close enough to feel it in the wind. The forest was waking. But survival wasn't finished testing them. Not yet. The first sign wasn't a flame. It was scent. Raven was the one who noticed. Early morning, before the birds had started their chatter, before the frost had lifted from the branches, she sat upright near the den, nose twitching. Something had changed in the air. A sharpness, a distant heat wrapped in pine and smoke. Marcus, higher on the ridge, felt it too. At first he thought it might be from a cabin miles away, someone stoking a wood stove. But the wind was wrong. It carried too much urgency. When he stepped out from his shelter and looked east, he saw it a soft column of smoke rising beyond the tree line. Thin, subtle, but growing. In the Bitterroot Mountains, wildfires don't always roar. Some whisper, some creep in with warm gusts and leave entire valleys changed by morning. This one had started with a lightning strike 2 days prior, hidden by snow-covered brush. But now the snow was melting fast, and the forest, still brittle from winter's grip, was ready to catch. Down below, the animals didn't panic, not yet. Elena remained in the den, her cub still too small to move far. Tucker circled more often. Scout, injured but alert, barked low and fast, his head raised to the wind. Raven paced tight ovals, watching the horizon. By midday, the smoke line had thickened. Marcus grabbed his radio and called it in into the ranger station, giving coordinates and wind direction. He knew the process. Aerial crews would check it out. Maybe it would stay contained, maybe not. But animals don't wait for reports. They read the earth differently. By late afternoon, Elena stood. It was the first time she'd fully emerged since giving birth. Her movements were stiff, her shoulder wound long, scabbed over. But her eyes were sharp, her ears angled toward the soundless threat moving through the trees. She sniffed the air once, twice, then turned toward Raven and let out a low chuff. The coyotes reacted instantly. Scout began sniffing along the path to the north, tail low, nose skimming the ground. Tucker moved to the rear of the den, checking escape routes. Raven circled back, then paused near Elena's cub, who, still wobbly, peeked from the den for the first time in daylight. There was no panic, only purpose. Marcus lowered his camera. He'd seen elk run in herds, wild turkeys scatter, even mountain lions leap trees to avoid blaze paths. But he'd never seen an interspecies group move like this, like they'd done it before. Elena leaned down and nudged her cub forward. The cub squeaked, legs trembling, but followed. Slowly, hesitantly. She walked beside him, her bulk acting like a wall between him and the wind. Tucker flanked them from behind. Raven scouted ahead. Scout remained to the side, watching, ready to redirect. Together, they left the den behind. The wind picked up. The smoke rolled low now, not just a column, but a creeping veil that blurred the trunks of trees and dusted the air with ash. Still no flames, but the heat was rising. An hour passed. They reached a narrow creek, half frozen but flowing. Elena stepped in without hesitation. The cub hesitated, but when Raven darted across tail high, he followed. His first swim, his first cold shock. He made it, clumsy, shivering, but alive. Marcus followed from a distance, keeping downwind. His steps were slower, his eyes fixed on the sky now tinged amber. Wildfires in Montana have always been part of the ecosystem. They clear out the undergrowth, create fresh soil, open sunlight for new growth. But to those caught in the middle, the science means little. In 2003, near Glacier National Park, a wildfire forced an entire elk herd across a river, nearly half of them drowned. In 2018, biologists in California documented coyotes traveling over 30 miles to find new den sites after fire displaced their packs. Grizzlies, too, are known to abandon dens when threatened, but rarely with cubs this small. And rarely with a company. Elena led them west toward higher ground. Her limp was visible now. The weight of the journey pulled at her shoulders, but she didn't stop. The cub stumbled more than once. At one point, Tucker gently nosed him forward, not parental, not sentimental, just present, helping. Raven veered left at a split in the trail, sniffed the earth, and barked once, short and sharp. Scout moved that way. Elena followed. The fire was near now. The scent was undeniable. Somewhere behind them, the den would already be lost. Marcus couldn't see the flame yet, but he heard it. A low hum in the wind, like the forest breathing wrong. Then, as if placed by fate itself, they found shelter. An old mine shaft, forgotten, partially collapsed but deep enough. The air inside was cool. The ground is solid. Safe. Raven entered first. Tucker followed. Elena hesitated, checking the mouth, sniffing the stone. Then she nudged the cub inside step by step. She entered last. Scout remained at the entrance for a while, ears forward, tail still listening to the ridge. He stayed there long into the night. Marcus never saw flames past the cave, but he saw the orange light reflected in the low clouds. He didn't know how long they remained inside. Hours. A day. But when he returned the next morning, the wind had shifted, the smoke had lifted, and paw prints led back into the woods. They'd made it. Elena had led them out, but not alone. There's something powerful in watching survival unfold, not as chaos, but as choreography. Each animal moved not as a solo instinct, but as a unit. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Maybe family doesn't always look the way we expect. Maybe it's less about biology, more about behavior, about staying when it's hard, about returning when you could leave, about sharing warmth, direction, protection without needing to name it. Marcus looked over the trail one last time. 4 sets of prints. 5 if you counted the tiny ones between the bear's steps. All headed uphill, all in the same direction. He exhaled long and quietly. Sometimes the wild doesn't need our help. Sometimes it just needs our witness. By the time the wildflowers began to push through the ash-covered soil, the forest had changed. Not in a dramatic way. No banner waving, no finish line crossed, but in the quiet way. Spring always rewrites what winter tried to erase. The burned trees still stood, their trunks blackened. The scent of smoke still lived in the moss, but life was moving forward, one paw print at a time. Elena moved more slowly now. Her limp was more pronounced, her shoulders leaner than before. But her cub, healthy, alert, and nearly the size of a young black bear, was thriving. He chased shadows, climbed over fallen logs, nipped playfully at Raven's tail, and flopped onto Scout's back when the older coyote lay down to rest. And though Tucker often pretended to ignore him, he'd sometimes leave half a vole behind on purpose, just close enough for the cub to find. Marcus called him Ember. It wasn't scientific. No collar, no ID tag. just a name scribbled in the corner of his journal and whispered to himself when reviewing footage at night. Ember, born in fire, raised in the impossible, and still whole. The family, if it could be called that, had stayed together longer than anyone would have expected. The grizzly, the coyotes, the cub. No fences, no handlers, no feeding stations. Just a strange evolving alliance that somehow worked. But as spring bled into summer, the air changed again. The wind felt lighter. The forest is louder. The cub wandered farther. And Scout, for the first time, began howling at night. It was time. Nature doesn't give farewells. There are no ceremonies, just distance. One morning, Tucker didn't return from his rounds. 2 days later, Scout followed a trail east and didn't come back. Raven lingered the longest, sleeping at the edge of the glade, watching Elena and Ember from a distance. Then one evening, after the cub had fallen asleep beneath a tree, she stood stretched and walked into the trees without looking back. Only Elena remained. With Ember. Some viewers might ask, why did they stay so long? Why didn't instinct drive them apart sooner? The truth is, science can't always measure relationships like these. Traditional wildlife biology tells us that predators stick to their roles, that grizzlies and coyotes are competitors, not companions, that interspecies bonds in the wild are fleeting if they exist at all. But evidence is shifting. In 2015, researchers documented a black bear in Florida that repeatedly returned to the same site to share food with a mated pair of red foxes. In Yellowstone, a grizzly was observed walking for miles alongside a lone gray wolf, not hunting, not chasing, just existing together. Even polar bears, typically solitary and aggressive, have shown signs of play behavior with sled dogs under specific conditions. Are these friendships? Not in the human sense, but they are something. Connection, maybe. Recognition. A shared moment in a world too wild for permanence. Elena would go on to raise Ember through his first full year. Marcus tracked them until the signals became too faint, the trails too sparse. He never saw them again. But the last image his trail cam captured was this, the cub nearly grown standing atop a rock, gazing downhill toward the old den site. Elena beside him, her head tilted slightly, ears forward. They didn't look back, but Marcus did. When he gave his final talk at a conservation conference the following fall, he didn't show charts or trend lines. Instead, he showed a 4-minute clip Elena licking Scout's face as the cub dozed beside them. No narration, no commentary. Just the sound of wind paws shifting in snow and the breath of animals that weren't supposed to coexist. When the clip ended, the room stayed quiet for a full 30 seconds. Then someone whispered, "I didn't know they could do that." Exactly. Because when we talk about wild animals, we talk about power, about instinct, about survival. But rarely do we talk about compassion, about choice, about the moments in between the ones that don't fit into categories. This story was never about a grizzly bear giving birth. It was about what happened after, about a trio of coyotes that didn't leave, about a man who broke the rules to help and stayed quiet about it, about a cub that grew up thinking family came in all shapes, all sizes, all species, and perhaps about us. Because if they can do that, what else are we getting wrong about the wild? What else are we getting wrong about each other? There's something deeply human in this story, hidden beneath fur and paw prints and pine needles. It reminds us that survival isn't always solitary, that strength can be shared, that healing sometimes walks in on 4 legs and doesn't speak your language but stays anyway. And maybe in a world that often feels fractured and fast and unforgiving, that's the story we need most. A story not just about wildlife, but about wild life. The kind that's full of mystery, mercy, and second chances.